With the balanced data slate here and the changes to some of the core rules having been discussed in the earlier video, with certain stratagems like Armor of Contempt being hit with the nerf bat, as well as the 3-inch deep strike abilities being pushed back to 6 inches, there are still some more changes to consider for most of the factions in the game, to be honest. And in this video, we're going to be taking a look at what has come along for the Tyranids, because not only did they get some of the most significant changes in the data slate, they are also an army that was directly impacted by the 2 core rules changes. The Trygon lost its ability to show up 3 inches away, albeit in exchange for a 20-point drop in price, and they also got hit in the Armor of Contempt reduced AP nerf, because their stratagem of reinforced hive node from their Synaptic Nexus detachment also catches that same nerf. So now you cannot protect a unit for an entire phase of enemy shooting or melee. It is against just one specific activation. So yes, there are a couple of nerfs in terms of how the Nids will perform army-wide from this data slate, but you do have to consider that most, if not all, factions will be impacted by these changes in one way or another, at least by one of them, if not by both of those changes. So whilst this is a nerf for the Tyranids, it isn't a direct one aimed solely at them. In terms of the Tyranids' own actual unique rules, following their nice buffs around Synapse in the last data slate, there looks to be even more coming, which is focused in this data slate specifically on their Assimilation Swarm, which at present is one of their detachments that isn't seeing a huge amount of play due to a few underwhelming aspects. It's got a underwhelming lots of hoops to jump through detachment rule, and then one of the other big downsides to it is that there just aren't that many units in the roster that have the right keyword to fully take advantage of it. At present, the Assimilation Swarm lets you pick each harvester unit in your command phase with the Feed the Swarm rule, and if it's within range of an objective that you control, it lets you regenerate one friendly Tyranid unit within 6 inches of your harvester unit, and that gives the chosen unit back D3 wounds, or lets you return an infantry model to the unit, or up to 3 models if the unit is an endless multitude one. So it can be quite tricky to really fully take advantage of. And as I said, the only units that are actually harvester units in the codex are the Haruspecs, the Psychophage, the Pyrovores, and the Ripper Swarms. So in terms of what is actually good and top tier, it's not really a great selection of units. Apart from the Haruspecs, the other 3 I really don't think are seeing a huge amount of play in terms of being a top tier pick, so it can just in general be a very difficult, awkward detachment to work around and get the benefits from. So Games Workshop have decided to give it a couple of unique buffs to make it just a little bit easier to get some mileage out of. And the first way they've done that is to very simply give another unit the harvester keyword, and that unit is the Norn Assimilator. This has always made sense, and it's always been a bit weird why it didn't have it to begin with. The unit that's got Assimilator in the name should really be able to work with the Assimilation Swarm detachment. So that was always a bit of a weird thing, but now it finally does have the keyword it arguably always should have, and on top of that, it's also had a nice little points drop. It's dropped 15 points down to 275. So not only can it now interact with the detachment, it's also a tad bit easier to fit into your lists now. So you essentially have one more unit that you can bring in this detachment to try and get that regeneration ability spread out across the rest of your units. On top of that quality of life change though, they've also buffed the Feed the Swarm rule so that the aura just comes from the harvester unit itself, and that unit doesn't need to be in range of an objective you control. So now it is much easier to just have one of your harvester units nicely tucked up safe in the middle of a few other units, and you still get to proc this ability in your command phase, whether you are near an objective or in one of the far-flung corners of the board, you will still get to activate it. So it is massively more simple to get it going off with this change, which is one of the biggest improvements, I think, in terms of how they've made this detachment just work more sensibly. Another change they've brought in is that the actual regeneration now returns more wounds. You now heal D3 plus 1 wound rather than just D3. And this may not seem like a huge change, but going from a possible 1 to 3 to a possible 2 to 4 is quite a good and impressive bump. It gives you much more protection, 100% more protection against those bad rolls, and it means you are much more likely to be able to bring up a character or a monster or whatever back from being bracketed to being actually hitting at their full weapon skill or ballistic skill or whatever. So again, it is just a very small but very useful change that works with the other changes they've brought in to make the detachment just feel better and be more viable. Now, does this make the Assimilation Swarm a top tier competitor for the Tyranids? It's a tricky thing to answer because I do still think the Invasion Fleet, the Vanguard, and the Synaptic Nexus are still very good, and it's going to be hard to pull away from them. But when you consider that the Synaptic Nexus is a bit worse now because it's lost the Armor of Contempt stratagem, or it's had that nerfed, because that's where you got that Armor of Contempt stratagem, so that's arguably a little bit worse than it was before. But being able to bring a few Haraspexes, some Rippers, and of course now the Norn Assimilator is really going to help you get this buff off, this detachment buff off, on at least a few units every single turn. And even just things like the Haraspexes and the Assimilators using this on themselves to keep themselves topped up as they charge around the board is a really nice ability for them. So if you are going heavy on Haraspexes and Assimilators specifically, this could be a really good detachment for supporting them. And with the Assimilator now also getting the points drop, 275 points for a toughness 11, 16 wound monster with a 2-up save, and with fairly terrifying strength 10 or strength 13 in melee thanks to Synapse, he really is a big threat. So being able to much more easily and simply fit this unit into this detachment has made a huge impact, I think. It definitely gives the detachment a lot more potential, and I think even if it isn't going to be the go-to option at the moment, it certainly makes it a detachment that you can't just dismiss out of hand. And depending on how you are building your list, the Assimilation Swarm could well be the best one to go for, even over the Vanguard or the Invasion Fleet. With some of the other points drops that we saw in this balanced data slate and field manual, the Norn Emissary got a drop of 15 points as well, and the Emissary was already seeing a little bit of play in some games, so that's just got even better no matter what detachment you are bringing. The Tyrant Guard also got a drop. They dropped 5 points for 3 or 10 points for a full 6, so you may see them a bit more, especially if you are running a Walking Hive Tyrant, although I'm still not personally sold on Tyrant Guard. I still don't think they're particularly good, but they are at least cheaper now. The only other big change for the Nids was the previously mentioned Trygon, who, as I said, did drop 20 points. He's gone down to 150, which, let's be fair, isn't awful for a toughness 10, 14 wound, 3-up save monster with 12 attacks at damage 3. But the real big draw of this guy was that 3-inch deep strike. So losing that, even though it's only been pushed back to a 6-inch deep strike rather than all the way back to 9 inches, that is still a big hit for him. And with his base 10-inch move, I do wonder if it is just better to start this guy on the board now and run him up the board if you wanted to take him, in which case if you were doing that, he's probably better suited to the Vanguard Onslaught detachment because he has the right keywords for that, so he can move up his 10 inches and still advance and charge to get into the enemy, so he's probably going to be quicker at getting where you need him in that detachment. But at 150 points, I think he's probably worth a test run just to see how he works out running him up the board, because he does have a lot of wounds, he is good toughness, he's got an okay 3-up save, and he can be quite scary in melee with his number of 3 damage attacks. But that is going to be it for the Nids. There were a few small points adjustments and the core rules nerf that they caught, but actually, in terms of the Assimilation Swarm, there were some fairly decent buffs, and I do think that it means you are going to be able to bring, if you bring that detachment, a really quite durable army that you can keep healing up and bringing models back again and again and again, and then as your Haraspexes and your Norn Assimilators hit the enemy lines, they are still going to be hopefully at almost full health, and they can just rip your opponents to shreds with their really quite scary melee. So I do think that at least one of the, or at least a few of the key downsides of the Assimilation Swarm have at least been partially fixed. It's easier to get the buffs off now. You've got more selection in the units that you want to bring that work with the detachment, and it is just a little bit easier to have it all kind of come together. So if nothing else, I think it's gone from an awful detachment to one that, with the right piloting, could work quite well for you. But as always, what do you think of the Nid changes in this data slate, and will you be trying out the Assimilation Swarm in some of your games? Let me know how it goes, as well as any of your other thoughts and theories down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.